We are working our way through the entire Bible. Part of the week we study the Old Testament. Part of the week we study the New Testament. We originally were just going to go one book at a time, one side of the Bible at a time, but I realize we need to spend more time studying the whole Bible. We need to hear the whole message from God, and I think it's been incredibly valuable. We're starting to realize that God has been saying the same thing since the very beginning, since the time of the garden. We're finding that come up more and more, and it's been incredibly valuable to us. This part of the week, we study the book of Genesis. We are up to the 16th chapter of Genesis. We're only just getting started. Let's jump right in. We'll start tonight on verse 2. Genesis 16:2. Just as a reminder, I read out of the King James. It is a very old version of the Bible. It may confuse you. It's probably best if you follow along in the Bible that you have in front of you. If you get a little bit lost, go ahead and look up at the screen because we put the verses down from the King James. Here we go. Genesis 16:2. And Sarai said unto Abram, Behold, now the Lord hath restrained me from bearing. I pray thee, go in unto my maid. It may be that I may obtain children by her. And Abram hearkened to the voice of Sarai. Now, the significance of this moment cannot be overstated. But I want to make sure that those who are new to the Bible know what's going on. This isn't complicated, but for those who are unfamiliar with these sorts of things, this can be a little confusing. In ancient cultures, as it is even in many places around the world today, childbirth was essential. We've talked about that before. There was a time in human history when people didn't view pregnancy as a disease, as something to avoid or correct. Those ignorant savages actually thought having children was a beautiful thing. I know, what were they thinking? Anyhow, in a society that chronically undervalued women, being a mother in ancient Israel was often the only chance to contribute to the community in a meaningful way, which of course meant that if a woman, for whatever reason, was infertile, she felt worthless to society. In fact, as we'll see later on in this chapter, a woman's status was directly tied to her ability to have children. We'll bring that up a couple more times as we discuss chapter 16 because it's a significant contributor to the events in this record. So Sarai to this point is childless, and she's actually quite old by now. By natural means, she is long past childbearing age. God has said to her repeatedly that that was not a factor for him, but Abram's wife was feeling the pressure. Just like Marissa Tomei's character in My Cousin Vinny, she feels her biological clock is ticking. So in what can only be described as a desperation move, Sarai suggests to Abram that he father a child with her slave girl. Although this sounds monstrous to you and me, this was not such an unusual suggestion at the time. Very often, concubines were used as surrogates to the elite members of ancient societies for succession purposes. Of course, that does not make it right. In fact, as I've often told you, if the world approves of your actions, you'd better think twice. If only Sarai and Abram had thought twice. Now Sarai, Abram's wife, bare him no children, and she had an handmaid, an Egyptian, whose name was Hagar. And Sarai said unto Abram, Behold, now the Lord hath restrained me from bearing. I pray thee, go in unto my maid, that it may be that I may obtain children by her. And Abram hearkened to the voice of Sarai. Now, this is a theme that repeats itself throughout Scripture. You see, this is one of the most pernicious and persistent sins of mankind. And it's one of those sins that very often hides itself in a cloak of worldly righteousness. We praise people who behave this way. Just another example of God's ways and our ways being polar opposites. Sarai, after waiting longer than she felt she should, decided to take matters into her own hands. As I said, we love this kind of stuff, don't we? We admire those who take the bull by the horns, grab the initiative, jump in with both feet. We venerate those who do and scorn those who wait, right? We're Nike society. Just do it. If you want something done right, you have to do it yourself. Well, every single time we see that sort of behavior, that attitude in the Bible, when someone decides after losing patience to seize the opportunity, disaster follows. Failure always results, listen to me, when we neglect the instructions God gives us and go off and make our own plan, as Sarai did here. In fact, this event is so foundational that it's mentioned over and over throughout the Bible as the antithesis of God's way of doing things. You see, this is doing and not believing. Sarai, and to a lesser extent Abram, they stopped believing and started doing. God said, "Trust me." And like all the rest of us, they found that to be the hardest instruction to follow that they'd ever been given. And here's something else about this verse I've discovered. This shows us God's tendency to put us in the perfect, listen to me, everybody listen to me. This shows God's tendency to put us in the perfect position to impress him, as well as our tendency to fail him at nearly every time. God wants us to show him our faith, and we fail every time. You know, God is incessantly teaching us something. And most of the time, what he's teaching us is that we're not as impressive as we think we are. Now, of course, God doesn't do that to embarrass us. He does it to protect us. If we would have just listened when he said, pride comes before a fall, he wouldn't have to prove it to us so often. We ignore such things, or we think God's talking to someone else. Certainly he couldn't have meant me. I mean, I'm the most humble person you know, and I'm darn proud of that. And then God frequently leads us into situations where we must trust him or suffer the consequences. What's your point? Don't get to the suffer the consequences part. When God says trust him, do it. You'll be better for it. So I truly do sympathize with Sarai and Abram, but this is still a bad look. And Sarai said unto Abram, behold, now the Lord hath restrained me from bearing. Now this is just the frustration talking. God never said he was going to prevent Sarai from having children. In fact, the opposite. God said he would cause Sarai to have a child. Even if she was born barren or became barren in life, God said he would fix it. There's really only one reason Sarai would say that God restrained her from having children. She lost faith. Sarai became impatient and she lost faith. And Sarai said unto Abram, behold, now the Lord hath restrained me from bearing. I pray thee, go in unto my maid. It may be that I may obtain children by her. The original language is very evocative. It's actually quite poetic. The original word is a verb that means to build up. Sarai thought she could be built up by Hagar. She could lay down a foundation of respectability through the children her slave would bear. Sarai's impatience, lack of faith, and ego, frankly, led her to concoct a plan that she was sure would turn out peachy keen for her, since, in her mind, Hagar was her personal property. She was free to treat her in any way she felt was necessary. Sarai saw Hagar as nothing more than a household item that she could exploit as she saw fit. And if her plan was successful, Sarai would just co-opt the result as her own child and thereby cement her place in God's plans for the posterity of her husband. John, aren't you being a little tough on her? You tell me what she's thinking, because this is not a good idea. To me, she thought she was super clever. Who needs God when you're this smart, right? After all, what could go wrong? And Abram hearkened to the voice of Sarai. Of course he did, and it bums me out. Anyhow, and Sarai, Abram's wife, took Hagar, her maid, the Egyptian, after Abram had dwelt 10 years in the land of Canaan. Now, I think all this part is giving us a chronology. God wanted us to know. He mentioned the 10 years because he wanted us to know that this happened 10 years after he called Abram and Sarai out of Ur of the Chaldees. Now, to me, and this is my opinion, to me, God is painting a picture for us. I think we're to get it into our heads that the years are coming and going, and having a timeline assists us in that feeling. I honestly believe this. God wanted us to get an idea of where these two failed. Listen, there's more to this than just filling our heads with facts. I know I tell you that all the time. I remind you that the Bible has a myriad of lessons to teach us, that there are things we can see in these stories that we can apply to our own lives. We can learn from the mistakes and the triumphs of the people portrayed in Scripture. In the past, our teachers, preachers, and ministers have elevated these Bible characters to the point that we don't dare see them as human. They've been placed on these pedestals to the point that we don't dare allow any feelings in our hearts that might seem critical of these God's supposed favorites. They are God's favorites, but they're still human. They're no different than you and me when it comes to being human. I think it's okay to see them as flawed. In fact, I think if you fail to see that they're flawed, you're actually missing part of the reason God put these stories in the record. We're meant to see them fail. We're meant to see them make mistakes. And oh boy, do they ever make some doozies here. And you know, I don't see enough scholars calling them out, as the kids today say. That was a major error in judgment. What Sarai decided to do was a major error in judgment. This, I believe, was a grievous sin. Not only did their faith absolutely crumble, not only did they ignore God's direct intervention in their growing doubts, they resorted to a tactic that's clearly against one of God's most basic rules. Abram, at Sarai's prompting, Abram actually also turned his back on his role as family authority and spiritual leader. Anyhow, Abram, as Sarai suggested he do, took a second wife. Listen, friends, there are lots of aspects to this story. There are lots of things we can learn here. In this life, we're going to face many crossroads. One fork in the road will be well traveled by the world, and the other will appear all grown over from the lack of use. And it's that seldom used path that is almost always the one God will want us to travel. Jesus once said, "Enter ye in at the strait gate, for wide is the gate and broad is the way that leadeth to destruction, and many there be which go in thereat. Because strait is the gate, and narrow is the way which leadeth unto life, and few there be that find it." I repeat, yes, taking a concubine was actually a common way to solve inheritance problems among Abram's neighbors, but that should have not been his excuse. Polygamy may have been regularly practiced in that part of the world, but that's not the way God builds families. Since literally the beginning, families were started and maintained by one man and one woman. And if it couldn't be done that way, it wasn't to be done. Now, there are plenty of good reasons why God chose that path, but none of that matters. We don't have to approve of God's methods. We don't even have to understand them. We're simply to obey. Abram and Sarai chose poorly and wickedly, in my opinion, and they created a mess for God to deal with. And not only that, they produced a lifetime of problems for themselves and their families to come. I feel like laying that J. Vernon McGee truth on you again. Abram got two things down in the land of Egypt which caused him trouble. One was wealth, and the other was this little Egyptian maid. All right, back to Genesis. And Sarai said unto Abram, "Behold, now the Lord hath restrained me from bearing. I pray thee, go in unto my maid. It may be that I may obtain children by her." And Abram hearkened to the voice of Sarai. And Sarai, Abram's wife, took Hagar, her maid, the Egyptian, after Abram had dwelt 10 years in the land of Canaan, and gave her to her husband Abram to be his wife. And he went in unto Hagar, and she conceived. And when she saw that she had conceived, her mistress was despised in her eyes. Well, that didn't take very long, did it? Almost immediately, Sarai starts to feel the fallout for this egregious act of impetuosity. Now, look, do I need to say this again? I know I'm no saint. I've done plenty of really stupid things when my faith wavered. I regularly ran out of patience for absolutely no reason. I repeatedly forget how God has taken care of me, these 60 plus years. But that doesn't mean I have to soften my opinions when I see other people making the same mistakes I make. We have got to learn all the lessons from this famous story, and the only tactic that will give us complete victory in this is to call things what they are. This was bad. Of course, God entered in it to work his good, but that doesn't relieve those two of their culpability. They messed up and shouldn't have. I know the feeling. We should all strive to live lives that don't end up causing God to step in to fix things for us. And Abram went in unto Hagar, and she conceived. And when Hagar saw that she had conceived, her mistress, I'm filling in the name so you don't get confused. And when Hagar saw that she had conceived, her mistress Sarai was despised in her, Hagar's eyes. Quite an awkward statement. That happens sometimes when translating from very old documents written in very old languages. Basically, what it's saying is that as soon as Hagar got pregnant with Abram's baby, she started viewing Sarai with contempt. Hagar looked down on her mistress because she couldn't conceive. She saw her as less of a woman than she herself was because she could not bear children. Thoughtless, heartless, and flat out mean. Like I said, everyone is a jerk in this story. No one comes out smelling like a rose. Again, this goes back to the cultural norms of their day. Infertile women were considered second rate. It's really an ugly thing, almost as ugly as our modern contempt for people who are fertile, who dare have children and decide to take care of them in a loving and present way. When she saw she had conceived, her mistress was despised in her eyes. To quote Joseph Benson, thus began the ill consequences of Abram's marriage to Hagar. Much mischief it made presently. I love the way those old-timey preachers put things, elegant and spot on. By the way, I don't like the use of despise there. Most of your translations have the word contempt in this spot. Neither of these really capture the intended intensity, in my opinion. Yes, these words communicate a negative image, but the original is far worse. As written in the English, we get the impression that Hagar simply hated Sarai for her barrenness. Well, there's more to it than that. In fact, it's worse. The Hebrew word is kalal, and it literally means to be light. It's not that Hagar reviled Sarai, she may have, but this is actually telling us that Hagar looked down on Sarai. She took an air of superiority over her mistress, an utterly grievous insult. This was a slave girl acting as if she could pass judgment on her owner. Seriously shocking. So despised was that type of behavior in that society at that time that there was even a special provision in the Code of Hammurabi that stated branding was the punishment inflicted upon the owner's handmaid who arrogantly set herself at equality with her mistress. That's a quote from the Cambridge Commentary. In cultures with a class system, as actually has been the case through most of human history and certainly was the case in Abram's day, an inferior so-called would never treat their betters with such disdain. But, as I said before, Sarai is reaping the consequences of her miscalculations. But you know what? I don't think she's learning anything. Again, I'm so disappointed. Verse 5, and Sarai said unto Abram, my wrong be upon thee. I have given my maid into thy bosom. And when she saw that she had conceived, I was despised in her eyes. The Lord judge between me and thee. Now, despite the tense atmosphere of this story, this actually makes me chuckle a little bit. I mean, it would seem that old married couples haven't changed much in all these centuries. Sarai decides to turn her anger on her husband. She's actually blaming him for all of this. And this, once again, gives the Bible its authentic feel. And Sarai said unto Abram, my wrong be upon thee. I have given my maid into thy bosom, and when she saw that she had conceived, I was despised in her eyes. The Lord judge between me and thee. Sarai created a situation that ended up humiliating her, and she acts exactly the way the rest of us do when that happens. I'm not making an excuse, far from it. but I'm looking at this with an eye to learn something from it. What's the lesson here? Why is God telling us this incredibly uncomfortable story? There must be a reason we're being subjected to this. All right, let's ask ourselves, what have we observed? Well, one of the more unkind things we do, all human beings, seem to want to blame those closest to us for the unpleasantries we endure. Most of the time, we tend to impute our frustration onto our spouses, don't we? If I stub my toe, I'm going to spend the next 5 minutes trying to figure out a way to blame Catherine for it. She'll realize that she left her keys in the car and then come tell me that I locked it too quickly. Now, forgive me for what seems like making light of a very serious situation, but sometimes the realism of Scripture is remarkable. Sarai sent her husband into the tent of another woman for a very specific purpose, and that action yields exactly the result she had hastily hoped for. And when that result starts to backfire on her, she decides to impugn her husband as the cause of her unanticipated embarrassment. Now, please don't get all feminist on me and assert that I'm shielding the man from blame. I've already and repeatedly expressed my criticism of the man in this scenario. But just because he's a man doesn't mean she's innocent. And just because she's a woman doesn't make her a victim. That one's not going to win me any points. And Sarai said unto Abram, my wrong be upon thee. I have given my maid into thy bosom. And when she saw that she had conceived, I was despised in her eyes. The Lord judge between me and thee. You know, there are some who read into this and say that Abram is actually to blame for Hagar's attitude. They'll tell us that somehow Abram showed favor toward Hagar over Sarai, and it was this that precipitated Hagar's insolence toward Sarai. In other words, Abram spoiled Hagar, and so she felt empowered to treat her mistress with impudence. Utter nonsense. There's absolutely nothing here that would lead us to such a conclusion. Abram's wife is mad and embarrassed and probably feeling quite foolish, so she's looking for a scapegoat, just like any of us would do. You see where I'm going with this, don't you? A subset of my teaching here is to get us to see ourselves in these characters. My wrong be upon thee. I have given my maid into thy bosom, and when she saw that she had conceived, I was despised in her eyes. The Lord judge between me and thee. This is incredibly gritty language. May the wrong that's befallen me be laid on your shoulders, Abram. This slave is looking down her nose at me. Can you believe it? This is your doing. And, I can see Abram, looking around, shrugging his shoulders, his hands out in front of him, turned up in a show of shock and bewilderment at this unjust condemnation. I'll say it again. This is one ugly story. There are no innocent casualties in this one. Listen, if Abram had been thinking straight, if Abram would have used the spiritual discernment God had been cultivating in him for the past 10 years, this would have never happened. Sarai may have been the architect of this disaster, but she had help. And then Sarai says to Abram, the Lord judge between me and thee. The things we say when our anger clouds our judgment. The things we say when we're trying to preserve ourselves. Self-preservation mode always is always characterized by a desperate lack of reality. We start making ridiculous statements. When we're feeling guilty and deflective, truth escapes us so easily. Now, what really has me stunned here, though, is that Sarai doesn't appear to consider that she has any responsibility in this mess at all. She honestly believes she's the innocent victim of Abram's misdeeds. Look, I'll say it again. Abram is no saint here, but the instigator of this fiasco is Sarai herself. She simply lost patience and faith. And yet what she says belies any sense of personal accountability whatsoever. And in its place, an unapologetic expression of arrogance. The Lord judge between me and thee. In other words, she's so incensed at her perceived mistreatment by her husband and the slave girl that she implores God to vindicate her. The Lord judge between me and thee. Dare I say, the tone is more of commanding God to vindicate her. She insists on bringing God into this Donnybrook. Now that's getting lost in your narcissism. When you're so self-righteous and so self-deluded that in the midst of this, when you're in the midst of really bad decision-making, you insist that God must mediate the mess you made. And what seems even more foolish is that she's actually trying to pit Abram and God against each other. That's not a good idea. You've heard me say it. God and Abram are tight. When Abram's at fault, yes, God will let him know. But let's none of us ever forget our place in the kingdom. Listen, we all need to know when we're mere bit parts of a grand plan. Because when we don't, we're going to really look stupid at best. All right, we're still making our way through this mess. Come back next time as we continue to try and figure out how we can avoid making mistakes that God has to fix. See you then.